We're going to start with that Raptors-Sixers game, which was super interesting on a bunch of different levels. Looking from the 30,000-foot view of this series, I talked about how the Sixers were the better team, and they had more talent. They should win the series, but there are some advantages with Toronto, specifically with their coaching staff, and the fact that Philly has some very specific weaknesses that over the course of the series, Nick Nurse should be able to exploit. The Raptors, while being a team that's at a massive talent disadvantage, they're not out of advantages entirely. They have advantages over this Philly roster, overall athleticism, overall foot speed, and then, like I said, at the head coach. And so as this series progresses, Toronto, I believe, will be able to be better with the adjustments. It remains to be seen whether or not that will be enough to overcome the talent or not. I thought the story of this game from the beginning, which was something we expected, I talked to you guys a lot this year about how the Raptors are a team that are super aggressive on defense. They're not a very disciplined kind of stay home type of defense. They're a gimmicky, aggressive defense, which is by design. Nick Nurse is empowered to do it that way. We all remember the box and one he used on the Warriors. Nick Nurse is not afraid to try things. And from the very beginning of this series, when they would run the Joel Embiid, James Harden pick and roll, there was a third defender coming over in the middle of the action. They decided we're playing 3-on-2 with this. And guess what? It's a lot easier to slow down the Harden Embiid pick and roll when you have three defensive players involved. That goes without saying. But what's the obvious downfall? It's 3-on-2 for the Sixers on the back end. And to their credit, James Harden and Joel Embiid did not force that action. We talked a lot about how James Harden doesn't seem to have the burst to beat guys off the dribble. He wasn't really showing that tonight. It's not like he was flashing around a ton of athleticism. James Harden won this game with his brain. And that's the best thing he can bring to this table. I don't expect James Harden to suddenly unlock 2018 James Harden in this series. I released a video the other day that I showed you guys where I went over some numbers. James Harden's finishing at the basket about half as often as he did in his 2018 season. His pull-up jump shooting is down 8% from where it was in 2018. He's relying on free throws for almost 40% of his offense since he went to Philly. James Harden has some significant decline in his game, but there's one area where he will never experience decline, and it's probably at a higher level than it's ever been, and that's his playmaking, his ability to read what's happening on the floor and make the right decisions. I've been critical of him at times in Philly of forcing the action and trying to play old-fashioned James Harden ball, running into bodies and throwing up junk trying to get foul calls and it not working instead of making the easy reads that are there. Those of you who have listened to the show over the course of the last couple months have heard me talk about that. Well, tonight, that's not what James Harden did. He made the right play consistently. And to the credit of the guys on the Sixers, they stepped up and knocked down shots. Tobias Harris knocked down shots. Tyrese Maxey knocked down shots. They all stepped up in big ways on the backside in order to make that coverage that Toronto was using not work. And then we talked a lot over the course of the preview that I did that Toronto's biggest advantage was transition. This has been a story with the Sixers all season. Part of it's because Joel Embiid is somewhat slow-footed. Part of it is because James Harden can be lazy at times, and they run these actions and they get into the paint with Embiid and James Harden, and they usually throw stuff up and they usually complain to the refs, and if you run the other way, you can get easy baskets in transition. Well, Toronto could never really get a hold of that pace side of the game. I always talk about the cascading effect of getting defensive stops. So if you have a foot speed advantage and you're the Raptors, the way for you to utilize that against the Sixers is by getting stops. You can't get out in transition unless you get stops. That extra couple of seconds, you can, to be clear, you can get out in transition after they've made shots. It's a lot harder. So the easiest way to get out in transition is to get stops. And if you're taking the ball out of the net every time, that buys Philly an extra second or two for their guys to get back. And as you saw tonight, when they got their defense set, it was a lot harder for Toronto to score. And then one of the weirdest things about today's game is the Sixers were getting out in transition going the other way. And the disappointing thing there, if you're a Raptors fan, is that just shouldn't happen. The overall foot speed of these lineups that Toronto's throwing out there is too fast to lose a foot race to this Philadelphia team. That just can't happen. That's attention to detail stuff. That's a little bit of effort stuff. And, I'm not surprised. The Sixers probably heard all week, including from myself, that they're going to lose this series. And they're probably like, screw that, man. Like, we're the better team. And so if you're Toronto, you can't lose those battles. You can't lose the battle that's supposed to be your advantage. You can't get beat in transition when you are the faster team. Those are little details that they're going to have to work out. Couple of silver linings for the Raptors. I thought their offense looked pretty good overall. They didn't, again, couldn't keep up with Philly in this particular game, but they scored enough, and they scored easily enough that if they can figure out some of these things on defense, particularly in transition and particularly with guarding the James Harden, Joel Embiid pick and roll, they should be able to score frequently enough. This is something that I talked about. Everyone was concerned about the Raptors half-court offense, but a lot of their talent was wearing suits all year. You saw, we saw OG Anunoby miss a huge chunk of the season with injuries. We saw Fred VanVleet deal with knee problems as the season was progressing. Guys were in and out of the lineup a lot. Pascal Siakam was dealing with some injuries early on in the season. So having them all together now, there actually is a decent amount of defensive or offensive talent on the floor. I thought Scotty Barnes even had some moments where he flashed some offensive creation off the dribble from the top of the key and finding cutters and things along those lines. Toronto's going to be able to score, it looks like. That's a good news. But they have to figure out how to stop Philly. I thought the story of the game tonight was what you saw was that third defender wasn't enough to stop that action because they were making them pay on the backside. So you have two options from there. You can either sharpen up the backside rotations so that you don't give up open threes there, but it's going to put a lot of stress on your athletes to fly around the floor. Or you have to go 2-on-2 with the Harden and Embiid pick and roll. There's some little things you can do there. For instance, have that third defender ready to go after Embiid catches the ball. That's what I would do. I'd switch that screen and roll and basically force James Harden to pull the ball out and either isolate whoever the big guy, whether it's Precious Achiuwa or somebody like that, whoever it is, pull the ball out and either isolate on the center or have to work it back to the post to Embiid. I thought the Raptors actually did a pretty good job on Embiid post-ups of crowding him and taking that stuff away. It was the screen and roll where they were getting killed. So if you can switch that action and force them to make a post entry, I like our chances better there if I'm Toronto. That third defender coming over too soon, they were getting way too easy shots on the back end. So figure out how to play 2-on-2 with the Embiid Harden pick and roll if you can. They got to figure out what went wrong in transition, figure out those details. You can't get beat up and down the floor by the slower team in Philadelphia. And last but not least, you can't, if you're going to slow down, you successfully slowed down Joel Embiid and you successfully slowed down James Harden for the most part, especially as putting the ball in the basket goes, but you got killed by Tyrese Maxey and by guys on the weak side of the floor. So you got to figure out how to guard James Harden and Joel Embiid without letting the other guys get going. Really quickly on Tyrese Maxey before we move on to the other series from today. This is a classic example of how slotting can be advantageous for a team when you bring in somebody like James Harden as a talent. We're going to talk about this a lot with the Dallas Mavericks here in just a minute because they're experiencing the negative side of this slotting with what happened with Luka Doncic. But everything about the game plan for Toronto is geared around stopping the Harden Embiid pick and roll, right? Stopping Harden or Embiid post-ups and Harden in that screen and roll action. So as a result, the amount of defensive attention that's devoted to Tyrese Maxey is not very much at all. And a couple things, a lot of what Tyrese Maxey was doing in transition, that can be tightened up by everything we were just talking about with the details for Toronto. But this is what happens when you devote that kind of defensive attention to James Harden and Joel Embiid. You have a very talented young guard in Tyrese Maxey who's getting off right now because he's getting easy opportunities. That's the downside of doing that. That's part of why I think it's so important to get that James Harden, Joel Embiid pick and roll down to a 2-on-2 coverage so that you're not giving like incredibly easy opportunities for incredible players like Tyrese Maxey. Shout out to him. Made a lot of big plays today. Took over that game in the third quarter. Incredible performance. A lot of series left. Nick Nurse is the biggest advantage for Toronto. His brain. He's the best one of the best coaches in the NBA, definitely a better coach than Doc Rivers, in my opinion. He's their advantage. Him figuring this out as the series progresses is Toronto's best bet. I don't think this is anywhere near over yet. Round one goes to the Sixers.